Ahoy, everyone, and welcome to another video. And today I have a very special guest all the way from Barrel Aged Faith. I have Kyle here. How are you doing, brother?
Oh, doing great. Sam, thank you so much for having me on the show. I've been following you for a bit, and it's great to see your channel growing and having wonderful guests and discussions. So that's just wonderful.
Yeah, amen. Amen to that. Lord has truly blessed me. He's blessing your channel as well. You know, you've had some cracking guests on there. Um,
Yeah, you might just pass me right on up. It's great to see your growth and keep up the good work. And we'll see if we can get some more subscribers for you today, too. That'd be great.
yeah, that'd be awesome. I mean, the whole point as to why I've brought you on is that well, it's particularly for sort of two reasons, is that you've got a very interesting like story. You go on a very specific journey from Protestantism over into Catholicism and then over into Orthodoxy. But then also as well, you have this sort of I don't want to say obsession with C.S. Lewis, but obviously as a Brit myself, C.S. Lewis as well as J.R. Tolkien. Are very near and dear to our hearts and things like that. And it's interesting to sort of see the comparisons between Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and and the views of C.S. Lewis and things like that. So before we get into all of that, so for those who don't know you, who might be watching, who are you? What do you do on Barrel Age Faith? Like, just give a brief introduction for us.
Yeah. So, I have 7 kids, wonderful, amazing wife. Uh, we have a fun life. We like to hike and garden and read books, and we try to live a simple life, but it doesn't always happen. Of course, we're living in the world, but and yeah, we're Orthodox Christians, but we've had a journey. Barrel Age Faith is the channel that I have on YouTube. I also have like a Substack, like a website, barrelagedfaith.com, so you can find me in a few different places. But the channel itself is really focused on a few different aspects. I dabble in sort of like inkling studies. So you do see like C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. I have more things kind of planned down the road, including sort of doing more with like George MacDonald, even though he wasn't a part of the Inklings. He's kind of like this honorary person. Um, and there's some cool Orthodox Christians doing some work with his books and writings. So that's a cool thing. I also do. I like ancient church history, and so I oftentimes will kind of intersect sometimes the Inklings with the fathers, uh, uh, and then also I do talk about sort of the differences between Protestantism and Orthodoxy, or Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and so those are the kind of things that kind of show up on the channel. Sometimes archaeology and exploring. Partly, I've been doing a little bit more archaeology lately because of Michael's book, Early Icons, and so great book. But I've been dabbling in that a little bit too. So you kind of find a little bit of everything on Barrel Age Faith.
Yeah, it is a really great channel. It's a wealth of like little sort of nuggets of gold and bits and pieces, and I'm glad that I managed to sort of stumble across you, as it were, sort of a couple of months ago, and just sort of watching some of your content is really great. So I highly recommend anyone who's watching who hasn't checked out Barrel Age Faith, please do. All the details will be in the description below this video. So your journey, right? So you started off as a Protestant. Did you grow up Protestant?
Yes, low. I call it low church, evangelical. My parents were very devoted evangelical Christians. It begins with my grandfather, who really wasn't a practicing Christian, but it was really through Billy Graham and him. I think he heard the story of Jim Elliot, this kind of Christian martyr in the Amazon region. He went to Wheaton College. He died for his faith in the Amazon region. There were some kind of miracles almost associated with it. The tribes people seeing angels when he died, and that story converted my grandfather to Christianity, really. And so, from my grandfather and grandmother and my whole family, we were devout evangelicals. So I saw my parents, reading their Bibles every day and taking us to church. They started a church when I was young, so I spent a lot of time at church, several days a week. Uh, so that's how I grew up, was evangelical, but and it was very good. I was taught to have a personal relationship with the Lord, to study Scripture, to share my faith. But of course, like I think many evangelicals, because we're ahistorical without really like this history within the story of church history, I went through kind of a crisis of faith that most people at the time didn't know about. It was during high school, but I didn't really have any kind of robust intellectual backbone to my understanding of Christianity, so that was a bit of a crisis, and I also hadn't really looked at it from the standpoint of philosophy, and so I lacked a deep worldview. So those are the kind of crisis situations that I went through, but I eventually came out of it, um, and that's
Mm.
kind of where C.S. Lewis comes in.
Oh, really? Ha! Interesting.
Yes,
So,
yes.
how does C.S. Lewis sort of slot into this tale then?
Well, I think for many evangelicals, Lewis is a way. He's got a popular book, Mere Christianity, but he's got a lot of other books. And I think for many evangelicals, it can be an introduction to thinking a little bit wider. So even though he's popular for Mere Christianity, it's like I actually discovered robust Christianity through Lewis. I mean, he's talking about salvation, even in Mere Christianity, he's talking about salvation in ways that I hadn't quite heard. He's describing it really in ways more like theosis than necessarily just a transaction, kind of the way that I grew up as a Baptist. We had altar calls every Sunday, and there was a lot of pressure for people to go up. And that's what I felt was this kind of transactional type of Christianity and sin management. And so for Lewis, it wasn't just Lewis. There were other figures, both in all sorts of categories: church history, philosophy. But Lewis is a good example of helping, particularly evangelicals, think a bit more broadly. Um, and so he helped me tremendously. So I had a great appreciation for what he was doing. So Lewis, I would say, was played an initial part in bringing me back. I also had a lot of friends, and Lewis was playing a role for them, doing the same thing for them as well. They grew up evangelical, um, and they needed a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people. I think C.S. Lewis can oftentimes go very much underappreciated for a lot of the depth that he has within his writings. Because you hear the name C.S. Lewis, and you either think of, the Chronicles of Narnia, or you think of just mere Christianity. But you have his even his writing, the Screwtape Letters. When he's creating this fictional dialogue to this demon Wormwood. Is incredibly funny, but there's some very profound truths within those writings that are beneficial to the reader to be aware of, in terms of like spiritual warfare, and being aware of like how the enemy can infiltrate without it's sort of like a Trojan horse sort of attack sort of thing. He's a very, very, very clever writer, and I think it's well worth any Christian to pick up his writings, in my personal opinion.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. And I wouldn't say that I was impressed with him across the board. I do think that I didn't buy into his sort of like liar, lord, lunatic argument right away. I was like, well, he could have just been like this slow myth that people sort of uh, developed, or there's different criticisms that I think can be made of some of his works, and so I embraced Lewis's attempt and found it to be very refreshing, and but really it took me some years to understand his depth. Going through my journey, both as a Catholic and then into Orthodoxy, to see that he was really thinking about the fathers and church tradition at a level that I really hadn't begun doing yet. So,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah, I even wrote the forward to a translation of St. John Chrysostom's work, I believe.
St. Athanasius.
That's it.
Yeah.
St. Athanasius.
Yeah.
That's the
Which you
one.
can get through St. Vlad's. I need to get a copy. I don't have a copy. I need to throw it back here so I can. It's sort of like a barrel aged faith, sort of like almost book where it's like the fathers and Lewis kind of crisscrossing. So
Yeah.
it's fun. A fun book, but he does have this awareness, and he was either getting it directly from the fathers, or he would get it just by absorbing the medieval world. I mean, he was a medieval professor, and so he's just kind of absorbing that world. And I'll describe a little bit how he plays a role in my journey later on. But But for that purpose, he served it. And so I came back to the faith at a much deeper, more committed level. Then went to college at Taylor University, kind of this evangelical college in Indiana, very similar to like a Wheaton college that takes the integration of faith and learning very seriously. So it's very academic type of place, but in the evangelical tradition. And so I was kind of ready to be maybe a missionary, a world missionary, or I was considering becoming a Protestant pastor, but I wasn't sure. But eventually I did make that decision while I was in college. We can get to that, but that's why I was there. Was okay. I'm going to get a degree in theology, biblical studies, learn as much as I can about the faith, and then do something uh, somewhere in the globe. Was kind of the idea originally.
Mm. And so, you're I would assume you have this deepening, relationship, and a deepening of your overall sort of like Christianness worldview, and grounding your faith in some way. But then you veer off towards Catholicism at some point. So what? Because a lot of people who watch my channel might be on that journey, going over from like evangelical or non-denominational, or even perhaps Anglican or Presbyterian, or what have you, and looking seriously into the apostolic faith of you've
Yeah.
got Orthodoxy and Catholicism. So what sort of things was it for you that caused you to start to think a little bit differently, and start to take the ancient faith, the apostolic faith, a bit more seriously?
Yeah, so when I was in college, I would say that I was trying to build an ecclesiology, like what is the church? I had a fair understanding that Jesus was real, he was true, he was guiding my life. I was ready to serve him in every way possible, but I I I wasn't sure though what kind of church he gave us. Um, and so there was this journey to kind of deepen my roots during my studies, and so this is when the church fathers became very popular online. Well, they just started. Sorry, they were just beginning to be really published online and available for free. So this was like around 2005, 6. Uh, so I began reading the fathers outside of my courses because they were touched on in my classes, but we never really went in depth with the fathers, reading primary sources and such. Maybe one professor did that. He published a book and had primary sources. So he helped me quite a bit. So I began reading the fathers. I went to a conference at Wheaton College on the church fathers, which was the very first one that they had there. I think they've had several since, but that was a big moment that at this evangelical, well-known institution had a conference on the church fathers. And that was a bit eye-opening because I realized how much I just didn't know. I knew so much about scripture, but this world of the fathers, I was just so ignorant about. And so I felt very challenged to get to know them better. And I also thought that, I can't be a missionary and start churches in ministries around the world until I really answer this question about what am I even starting? So I went into sort of this kind of identity crisis, not as a Christian, but as in the area of what's the church. So I eventually graduate. During this time, I'm a part of a church planting network who's kind of raising me up as a pastor. But they gave you a lot of wiggle room in this church planting network. So starting new churches. So really, when I eventually came back to my hometown, but I was still part of this church planting network. And the whole idea was, okay, gather a group of people together. Uh, we started like a little gathering off of my parents' church, but the idea was that it was going to be sort of like evangelical Anglican, uh, really kind of rooted more so like it was going to be a journey, but let's get to becoming more liturgical, having communion every week, creedal, sacramental. Not everybody a part of that group probably knew that, but that's exactly where I was going to take it, to try to be basically as patristic, as Catholic, as Orthodox, as sacramental as possible. But in that process, I got to a point where I realized I don't have the authority to really replicate apostolic succession and ordination, and I wasn't really interested in joining the Episcopal Church or Anglican Church at the time for lots of reasons. Um, so that's where became a lot more open to what was going on in the apostolic churches. My best friend at the time also had just become Catholic. Uh, and this is where C.S. Lewis comes in. he was the president of the C.S. Lewis Society at Oxford, in your area. He went to Wheaton College, graduated, befriended Walter Hooper, Lewis's secretary, and also befriended Father Michael Ward, Anglican priest who became a Catholic priest, and many others. And so I was very much caught up into his journey. And so we had a lot of in-depth conversations. He's still my best friend to this day. We've got a close group of some dear friends, and he's one of my best friends. So anyways, we talked a lot about C.S. Lewis. We talked a lot about church history, the fathers. And at that time, I was heavily considering Catholic, Orthodox. I was even reading about the Assyrian Church of the East, which is based out of Iraq, the Coptic Church in Egypt, all these ancient churches that I was reading about in books. Particularly, I can pull up a few books, but this book by Philip Jenkins I began reading, which introduced me to there's more Christianity going on than just Catholic and Protestant. That was kind of eye-opening. The Lost History of Christianity. Another book, by Robert Wilkin, another church history book. So I'm reading all these books and just kind of realizing, my buddy in college gave me this book, Documents on the Christian Church. But I was really just captivated with apostolic Christianity. And so how did I become Catholic? In short, I became convinced that I could no longer be Protestant, and all of the other apostolic churches were really far from my hometown. And I got to the point where I believed that I had enough to go on to become Catholic, but I did have many unique views when it came to certain doctrines, and I took much more of an ecumenical standpoint on those key doctrines, for good or bad. I mean, people can have opinions like, "Oh, Kyle, you shouldn't have done that." Well, that's what I did, and we can talk more about that. But for me, I had enough to go on where I was reading all the ecumenical documents that were published between Catholics and Orthodox, Catholics and the Assyrian Church of the East, that were pretty much going through Pope John Paul II. So I felt like, you know what, maybe this whole thing's about to come together. I'm by nature a pretty big optimist. I'm not a doomsday guy at all. So I'm like, yeah, maybe this whole thing's about to come together, so it doesn't really matter anyways. And I remember repeating some of those lines to people who were leaving Protestantism and they were trying to decide between Catholic and Orthodox. I would oftentimes tell them, you know what, it doesn't really matter. They're the same thing. And so oftentimes, some of them became Catholic because for many of us in the Midwest, there just aren't Orthodox parishes around. You'd have to drive a couple hours to find one. So that is a real barrier. Had there been an Orthodox parish in my town, my story may have ended up a little bit differently. I may have become Orthodox back in 2011. I was very drawn to it. So anyways, that's how I ended up becoming Catholic in 2011.
It's sort of like, you've raised sort of a good point. It harkens back to scripture when it's talking about the path to salvation is narrow and hard and full of trials and tribulations and things like that, and that to me describes orthodoxy. Like, I mean, we're recording this now and Lent has just started. One of the hardest sections of the year for Orthodox Christians, because you have 40 days of strict fasting, and is incredibly hard, and also as well, taking place at the same time as Ramadan for Muslims. But when you compare the two, Lent is so much more harder because it's constant, whereas Ramadan, you have these sort of like breaks in between. It's not really a proper fast, if that makes sense. So I like to think that us Orthodox have got a leg up on the Muslims in that aspect.
Sure, yeah, and discovering the historic traditional way of fasting actually plays a role in my being drawn to Orthodox down the road of my story. So I'll share that. But
Yeah,
but it's true. It's a very serious time. Just had Forgiveness Vesper Sunday night and had Clean Monday, so we're in a we're in a very intense moment right now during this interview.
Mm, yeah, very spiritually charged as well.
That's right. That's right.
But I think, you know, especially more recently as well, because I was speaking to my priest on Sunday for after liturgy, and we introduced ourselves and said hello and had a lovely chat with him, and he was talking about the fact that um, their parish, when he took over, he it was sort of mainly was just an elderly congregation. You know, it was about a third full, and just recently it's just exploded, like in terms of popularity, and especially the young generation. He said that, you know, our church now is primarily people sort of like aged 40 or under. Now that's the overwhelming majority of attendees at the parish, and I find that absolutely extraordinary. And I think that's a testament to just the what people are genuinely searching for, especially younger people, because they're, you know, being served on a platter now. This whole thing of like, you can be anything you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do. You can, if you want to call yourself a lampshade, then you can. You know, that sort of thing. I mean, we've had a minister over in our country who said that it's okay to call yourself a llama. Just sort of like it's getting wildly out of control. But then, as a result, what we're seeing is this surge of people who are actually searching for some sort of identity, for some form of structure, for some form of rigidity, and something that echoes back to the past in a very real and tangible way. And there was a moment in the liturgy, and this is the first time I'm saying this on the channel, actually. So, you know, getting a little bit of an exclusive, but there was a moment in the liturgy where we were saying the Our Father, and we said it in English, and then the priest just said, "And now," in Russian, and then this guy just started speaking in Russian, and now in Cantonese, and this Chinese couple just started speaking the Our Father in Cantonese, and now in Bulgarian, and now in, you know, all this, and I was just like, I had something switched in my head, and I was like, this is the church that Christ established. Like
Oh, very Catholic,
so
huh? Yeah.
but like it was so profound. Like this was like a moment of like it was such a raw moment of like, all of these people are coming together in unison to worship one God, Christ, and to serve him wholeheartedly. But also the liturgy in and of itself is so ancient and well preserved, I think, is a testament to how seriously orthodoxy as a whole, and you can probably include Oriental Orthodox in this, how seriously they take tradition, and how serious, you know, like, you know, you've got icons that are still done in the Byzantine style and things like that, and preserving all these prayers from the church fathers and still using them in the daily prayers today. You know, I think it's a profoundly beautiful faith, and I fall in love with it deeper every single day.
Wonderful. It's great to hear, Sam.
Um, so you become Catholic, right? And you, like you mentioned sort of some of the issues that you sort of had, and sort of took a more ecumenical approach. Like, how significantly did those impact your day-to-day life as a Catholic?
Did which issues?
So you mentioned, like, you know, you sort of you had enough to become a Catholic,
Yeah.
but then there were sort of some things that you were sort of had a very radical or different approach to, that was a bit more ecumenical.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I was kind of naive about modern Roman Catholic Church history at the time. I was reading the fathers, discovering the ancient liturgies in the ancient church, all those things, and then I kind of skipped over some centuries. And so there is this moment. It took me kind of a couple years of kind of being in it. There is a moment where you realize something's happened here. Something's happened. Um, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but that was where I began questioning a little bit deeper. Not in order to really like become Orthodox or leave, but as a source of renewal. Okay, where do we need to be renewed? Um, my first couple of years, I mean, it's just lots of great things happening. I mean, at the time I was running a coffee shop and tap room that I had started with a few friends, and we did this thing called Theology on Tap, where we invited some Catholic speakers to my coffee shop, and that was fun. Like it was a cool time. We even had a he's now Cardinal Joseph Tobin, but he came. He was our bishop at the time in Indianapolis, Archbishop, and he came to my little coffee shop and tap room, and uh and now he's a close collaborator with Pope Francis. I have a little bit of a different view of him now as far as his views and how he operates. But at the time, I'm like, this is just awesome. And you begin visiting monasteries, and I'm going in on retreats and uh, doing things that I just had never really done as a Protestant. So really cool things like learning, okay, well, this is what relic veneration is, and um, this is what a sacramental life kind of looks like, and began reading the daily scripture reading. So there's a lot of good things. I generally, again, I'm an optimist, so I speak very positively of my experiences in my past. And I was having a good experience, and I had a good experience within Roman Catholicism. So I eventually get hired at our Catholic parish to be the Catholic youth minister, and then also to teach like 4 or 5 theology courses at our Catholic high school. Um, Eventually, I'm a youth minister for a couple years. Then I become the parish catechetical leader. So I'm kind of focusing more on both adults, but also uh, the children, like First Communion and courses for them. So I'm now getting like really into it as being on staff. And so there's one thing to be attending and realizing, something there's something in need of renewal here for sure. It becomes, I think, apparent that liturgical renewal, once you've been Catholic for a few years and you're aware of the fathers and the ancient liturgies, it becomes quite apparent like we're in need of some kind of renewal. And that's where you get into those battles. So when you begin working for a parish, you begin to see those liturgical worship battles happening right from the get-go, like Vatican II versus, well, actually more than one group, more than one version of Vatican II, uh, how people are interpreting it, how people are interpreting the worship. A lot had happened as far as changing even just what the church looked like inside. Our campus had 3 different parishes, 3 different churches within our parish, but you could tell one hadn't been tampered with, the other had been tampered with quite a bit. I mean, just whitewashed and the high altar removed, and it just looked like something happened, both in the liturgy and in the space. Things that just aren't possible within Orthodoxy, right? Like as you were mentioning, there's a whole canonical tradition to fasting. There's a canonical tradition to icons. And we view that as a part of the faith. Like it's a non-negotiable. Yeah, it has a type of cultivation, and you can see how it changes over the centuries, but that's a little bit different. There's these canonical boundaries. So I was becoming aware of this. I didn't really have the language for it back then, but I was becoming aware of that because, well, I was like, I'm hearing all about all these controversies in the parish, and I'm like, well, I should probably find out what I think about these things. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go back to the original sources. And that's when you begin realizing like, oh, like there were these things called minor orders, like subdeacons, and there really weren't girl altar servers, and chant had a primary place in the church, and um fasting was a big deal on Wednesdays and Fridays. And the debate in the early church, East and West, wasn't if we should fast, it was that the West was fasting too much. They were fasting on Saturdays, and the East didn't like that. So the West has now gotten to a point where it was like fasting in some ways too much to now it's not fasting hardly at all. Like I think in Lent you're called to fast twice. Like, the minimum is you fast on like Ash Wednesday and you fast on Good Friday, and then the Fridays of Lent are days of abstinence where you can have fish with backbone. So you begin just going from like topic to topic to topic, and you see, oh my goodness, we're in need of some like major reform to go back to how. And it's not like necessarily like screenshotting the second century and just trying to replicate that. That wasn't what we were doing in my mind. But we do need to kind of return to the original paradigm. That for me, I think helps people I think sometimes people misunderstand what I'm saying. They think I'm advocating for some kind of like screenshot of the 2nd century or 3rd century, and we have to just completely replicate that. It's like, no, but there is a paradigm. There are canonical boundaries. There is apostolic tradition, and that's a long conversation. But this is what I was slowly becoming aware of, probably about 4 years into being Catholic, and it was a place for me, a place of renewal. Okay, we need liturgical renewal, renewal in our asceticism, even our monastic life. When you see what's happened to monasteries in the modern day Catholic Church versus its experience of mysticism and contemplative life, it's not that it doesn't exist anymore, but it's been overhauled in many ways. So anyways, that's just to kind of begin scratching the surface of beginning to kind of open up a can. Yeah.
I think, like, I mean, for a lot of, I have quite a number of Catholic, subscribers and viewers, and like I don't want to sort of give the impression that we're trying to sort of poo-poo or slander the Catholic Church, because there are some people who have a profoundly deep and meaningful relationship with Christ within the Catholic Church, and I don't want to interfere in if that's where God has placed you, and that's where God has led you to experience Him in a way that He wants you to experience Him, then go nuts. That's okay by me. But for me, like, when I look at the Catholic Church now, and you see like the many, it's almost, it comes across to me as it's been tampered with too much, if you know what I mean. Like, you've got the various like changes and tweaks and alterations, and then obviously on top of that you have a lot of scandals and things like that that go on under the surface that then come out in the mainstream media, and everyone loses their minds and things like that. And often it doesn't paint the Catholic Church in a very good light. But having said that, there is something profoundly beautiful about having looked into Catholicism myself before finally realizing that God wanted me to enter into the Eastern Orthodox faith, is that there is still respect there for things like the Eucharist, and for Mary, and for all these other aspects of Catholicism, like in terms of like I think it's very admirable for priests to take a vow of celibacy when they enter into the priesthood, because it genuinely does free them up a lot in terms of being available for their parish when they need it, as opposed to worrying about if they have an issue with your wife or your child or what have you, it interferes with your priestly duties, that sort of thing. So I can understand why they do certain things, but for me, I think looking at it, if I'm serious, and when I'm looking at it, like, I often compare myself to the woman that was bleeding for 12 years, right? I'll explain what I mean. So she had the faith to reach her hand out and just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, having faith that she'd be healed. And she was. And I want to be like that woman. I want to stretch my hand back through time and just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, and to have the same faith, the same belief, the same structure, services, etc., as the apostles did. And I think that's so key, because especially when we're 2000 years removed, a lot of the times we have there's all kinds of like fiddlings and controversies and issues that spring up no matter where you go, in Protestantism, Catholicism, and even small changes within Orthodoxy. Like, for instance, instead of having services predominantly only in like Greek, like now you have services in English and things like that. But I think it's about finding the measured changes and not tampering where it's not needed, and not altering things where it's not needed, and preserving the roots of the faith and the core of the faith as much as possible, whilst also if something desperately needs to change in order to allow someone to to be able to experience the liturgy, for instance, in an English-speaking country like England or the US, then they have that available. They can have that deeper connection.
Yeah, yeah. I originally left Protestantism because of the unanimous consent that you find in the apostolic traditions. So it's like one of the ways that I escaped that Catholic Protestant gridlock, like you're wrong, Reformation, Counter Reformation. How I escaped that originally in 2011 was, well, look at all these other ancient traditions. They're not a part of the same battle, and they're saying similar things. So for me, originally, the reason I left Protestantism was because of the unanimous consent among the apostolic churches, among the apostolic traditions, Syriac, Greek, Latin. And so, but that I realized that that whole principle, though, can become problematic in the modern Roman Catholic world, because it's like, well, we know that the West practiced infant communion all the way up into the 12th century, and then it changed. And the question is, what enters into the mind, into that tradition, to say that we can override that which is like treasured and precious, like the gift of the apostles and the fathers, this practice of how we initiate people into the faith. And those three, baptism, chrismation, and communion, were always given united. There was a moment, though, in like kind of the 8th or 9th century where they would begin to slowly wait for the bishop to come to chrismate, so they might commune the infant, and then next week the bishop chrismates. There's a little bit of disjointedness later on, but overall, you have to ask the question: what enters into the system to cause you to want to begin to override that which is unanimous among the apostolic traditions? And that was the biggest itching question that I had, because it's not only with infant communion. All the ancient churches fast on Wednesdays and Fridays throughout the year. And there's a whole host of examples, subdeacons, how, the liturgies are different, but they do have like some overlap and some, a core to them. And the question is, it's like, if we've been given these ancient liturgies, what gives us the authority to even overhaul them? Why would you even want to? And that was a big question. Like, why would they even want to overhaul the liturgy in the 1970s? Like, what makes you even ask that question? That's a paradigm. That's a paradigm problem to cause you to even want to ask certain questions. It's one thing to introduce the vernacular. That's very well established throughout church history. When you're in mission lands, Saint Cyril and Methodius, right? The Slavic language. But what gives you the authority to like override? And that's where I began to see that there had been a little bit of a papal paradigm shift, where both through hyper scholasticism and through inflated papal doctrines, we can override those questions. We can override those traditions and give something better. That, I think, is the problem. And so you have Aquinas, who's saying that until the person has reached the age of reason and can give reverent worship, that's when they can receive communion. To me, that's an error. It's a false understanding of reverence. It's a false understanding of grace and initiation on all sorts of things. And then the Pope being able to like overhaul the liturgy in the 1970s with a post council, a committee after the council, which is not even really what the council fully wanted, it seems, but that's a long conversation. To get to the point where you even want to do that kind of massive overhaul, I think there's bigger issues going on. And so you also see that with even how icons or lack of icons, or how they're even altered in the Roman Catholic Church. All you have to do is look at some Rumpnik altered icons, and they're fragmented essentially. And those became quite popular all over the world. So again, this isn't these were not actually, these did not cause me to become Orthodox. That's that's still another story. But what I'm saying is, there was a growing awareness that we're in this massive need of renewal, canonical renewal. So I began looking much more to like the Eastern Catholics, and the Eastern traditions within the Catholic Church for this type of renewal. I probably would have began attending an Eastern Catholic Church, but I was already employed by my church here where I lived, and then also the Eastern Catholic churches were farther. They were even farther away from me than Orthodox churches, so I would have had quite the drive. But I began looking to them as a source of renewal. But in the end, my journey towards Orthodoxy became much more serious.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think you sum that up brilliantly in terms of like, you know, why, you know, what gives us the right to change something that is one of the jewels of the Christian faith. You know, it's almost like we are, because it's a hard lesson for us to learn about how we should bend to how God should be and deserves to be worshipped. But then the modern thinking now is that, oh well, you know, we can tweak and change this to make it easier for us. You know, you see this especially within Protestant churches now, you know, especially the non-denominational churches where basically every service is a rock concert. And that's so far removed from the ancient faith. Like, you have, you know, just comparing Orthodoxy and, you know, a non-denominational church today, you have the priest who faces away from the congregation for the majority of the service. You know, you have the iconostasis, and, you know, you have various different processions and things like that involving the masses who are in attendance to, you know, partake in the service as well. But then you compare that to a modern non-denominational church where, you know, you have those sort of big screens and, you know, smoke machines and lights and things like that. And then, you know, who do you see on the screen? The singer. You know, it's not Christ. It's not it's not you know, the Theotokos or anything reverent and honorific. It's the worship leader. And you're essentially elevating the worship leader to that sort of status of like, that is the focus of the work of the service at that point. And then you have the preacher that goes on for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, long sermons and things like that. And it's all very sort of fuzzy and feel good. Like it's very wishy-washy. Whereas when you read scripture, that's not how scripture reads at all. I mean, you just pick up the book of Judges. You have people being nailed through the head with a tent peg and stuff like that. And you know, people being disemboweled and stuff. It's a you know, it's a brutal account of history. And yet we have these accounts giving us the warm fuzzies and things like that. I find it's very very sad to see, you know, people sort of, I don't want to say like swarm, like trapped, but like they're sort of in too deep, if that makes sense. And they have sort of like the chick track mentality of like the Black Pope and, you know, the Illuminati, and the Catholic Church is part of the Illuminati, and it's all satanic worship and things like that. And I think that's it just shows how far we've come away from the core of what the church believes. And that's why I think Eastern Orthodoxy is so important, because it takes us back in time to it's a snapshot in time that plays over and over and over again every Sunday. Every single Sunday for you know, over 1,000 years, every single Sunday it's a snapshot in time. The same, like hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever, again and again and again and again and again. You know, without anything being, you know, added or taken away, or, you know, you have certain things that are enhanced, you know, or adapted to allow the congregation to be able to partake in the liturgy, like, you know, having it in English instead of Greek, or you know, English instead of Russian, or what have you. But it's there's sort of like an honor, that a badge of honor that we carry of how having it so unchanged. And I think that's so often lost with so many people.
Yes, yeah, I think there's been a lot of great books written recently, but connecting the worship of the temple, you know, in the Old Testament, and then seeing how that merged with the worship of the early Christians, where the synagogue and the temple merge into the worship of the early Christians, where you have the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, and all those things that are going on in those ancient liturgies. And so there's been a real inheritance from that, and we shouldn't think that we have the authority to change that, even if it's
Mm,
not moral. Like that's where I think sometimes within Catholic theology, it's like, well, it's not moral, it's not dogmatic. If it's disciplinary, then we can change it. And I think that's not the paradigm that we find in the first millennium. I mean, Saint Basil does say that we don't have the authority to override certain unwritten traditions, and he gives examples like ad orientem, praying east. So we all pray east. That's kind of an unwritten tradition that we wouldn't dream of changing. It doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions. It doesn't mean that there weren't some churches that weren't like that. But overall, this is a tradition that you find among all the ancient apostolic traditions. He also said that about the sign of the cross. Like we all make the sign of the cross, and he's
mm,
like, we just wouldn't. If we get rid of these types of things, he says this, we would injure the gospel at its very vitals.
mm,
I every time I read that line, I'm like, man, St. Basil, that is a strong line to say that we would
mhm,
injure the gospel at its very vitals. It still kind of takes my breath away when I read that line. And that's how seriously he took the unanimous unwritten traditions and practices. And so orthodoxy doesn't just take orthodoxy seriously, it takes orthopraxy very seriously. And that creates, in my mind, a type of ecosystem, a way of interaction between the beliefs and the practices, and forming or orienting yourself to God. Um,
mm,
that was to me an amazing discovery, and to me that was like, okay, this is what's going to renew Roman Catholicism. So I was very committed to like renewal, but I was also, if need be, ready to become Orthodox. And so by 2019, I had asked my wife to consider becoming Orthodox, and um, she wasn't ready. And I didn't really blame her, because I had taken her on a pretty wild journey from she
mhm,
thought she was marrying somebody who was going to be a Protestant pastor, to now like passing through Catholicism, and I'm working at a Catholic church and teaching Catholic theology, and beginning to get invited to speak at other Catholic parishes for retreats and give, a lot of good things happening, and I'm having a good experience. But I'm realizing that I don't think well, I definitely know I can't renew it, but I also was struggling to see the path of renewal. Uh, it doesn't mean I couldn't see some Eastern Catholics having many good things to say. It's just that I struggle to see the path of renewal. And then I also began having bigger problems with dogmatics, that is,
mm,
doctrine as well, which we haven't touched on that. I was touching more on those wider issues that are easier to identify. But getting deeper into dogmatics, I was working on a book about purgatory that I started around 2016. So I was getting really deep into indulgences, treasury of merits, all sorts of things that begin really taking on a whole life of their own in the Middle Ages. And the project that I was working on was actually deeply ecumenical. I wanted to basically write a fictional book with also non-fictional theological questions that would be acceptable to Catholics, Orthodox, and the other ancient traditions. And so that was really the project, was this book. And it took me, over the years, it took me sort of like on a wild ride of seeing oh, like the way that Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, talks about purgatory isn't really how most Latin theologians, uh, teachers of the faith, really talked about purgatory. Um, that was sort of a big moment uh, in my studies, because Joseph Ratzinger's writings uh, on purgatory, the intermediate state, I mean, many of them are beautiful. They're very personal, uh, and he sounds a lot like C.S. Lewis when Lewis is talking about purgatory. What's interesting though is when you begin reading Lewis, has hangups about the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Um, that can be a little, that can throw off a modern Catholic. It can throw you off a little bit, because you're like, well, I'm reading the new White Catechism that was written in 1992, and I'm reading Pope Benedict the 16th. who wrote a whole encyclical in like 2007, and all these new documents on really a renovated purgatory. It's been essentially renovated to come back more in line with the ancient faith, ancient understanding. But when you really look at the Council of Florence back in the 15th century, when you look at Latin theology, what's pretty much dominant is that this is a place of expiation and satisfaction, and punishment, and that most major teachers of the faith taught. Now, this was never dogmatized at Florence. That it was a created fire meant to torment and satisfy sins, as well as purify. But the different teachers had different takes on that. So I realized, oh my goodness, this, like, the way that Latin theology was really articulating this for about 600 years, I could see why Orthodox would find it problematic and unacceptable, because it doesn't harmonize with Orthodox theology. It doesn't harmonize with Orthodox theology. The modern view is actually much closer to Orthodox theology. And what I found is that, like, really, the Catholic theology today on this topic of purgatory really has come back around to be much closer to the position of St. Mark of Ephesus at Florence than the Latin position. Which to me was, it doesn't necessarily say, oh my goodness, this disproves all of Roman Catholicism. That's not quite what I'm saying. But it does point to a stability, an inner stability of Orthodoxy. We're in this interview, we've already talked about how Orthodoxy has maintained a type of stability in many areas of apostolic tradition. In the area of the intermediate state, it's not Orthodoxy in need of doing some kind of massive renewal along this topic. It's very much rooted in the fathers, and the fathers do have some diverse perspectives on the intermediate state before the return of Christ. But Catholic theology the Catholic theology to me was in need of renewal. And I think many people were admitting that, to where if you really look at like what was happening with the practice of indulgences, even in the early 20th century, with a lot of the accounting of the numbers and all sorts of things, by the time you reach the 1960s and 70s, they're realizing this needs to be renewed. Joseph Ratzinger was saying that. Karl Rahner was saying that. He wrote a whole piece on indulgences. There's this realization that their theology didn't look deeply personal. It looked like a little arbitrary. It looked like let me give you one quick example. And these are the things that actually kind of pushed me into Orthodoxy. It's not the only thing. There's many other topics we could talk about. But for example, when you contrast the Orthodox position with the Catholic position, at the Council of Trent, Roman Catholicism says that God's vengeance still remains even after absolution, even after forgiveness in confession. And this vengeance is still directed towards a type of temporal guilt on your soul. So in confession in Roman Catholic theology, eternal guilt is forgiven, but temporal guilt related to temporal punishment is still there. And it even connects both in the Catechism of Trent, but also the Council of Trent. It connects it with the vengeance of God, which makes a lot of sense when you think about how Latin teachers were talking about purgatory for most of its history in the Middle Ages, and that is a created fire, material fire, that's meant to torment and satisfy. That makes a lot of sense, because that looks very much kind of like vengeance. And so when you look at Orthodox theology, even before the Council of Trent, St. Mark of Ephesus says, no, when the king forgives, no punishment remains. And there are many Orthodox teachers. I've got a whole essay that I haven't published yet, and a course that's getting ready to launch, kind of diving into like the thought of C.S. Lewis with the Orthodox position on purgatory and contrasting it with some of the Latin teaching. Now, I think we've made a lot of progress. I think the positions have become a lot closer today, but indulgences are still an issue to be worked out, and there's other issues to work out as well, along with this issue that I'm bringing up at the Council of Trent. But in Orthodox theology, it was that when you are forgiven, yes, fatherly discipline can still remain, just like after your baptism, you're still your spiritual father's not going to say, "Oh, you were baptized, you don't need to fast." No, they're going to be like, "You need to fast. Like you need discipline." Um, and Orthodox theology would say it's fortifying your life, it's healing your life, it's causing, it's bringing about an ascent of the soul, theosis, but it's not paying for past sins that are already forgiven. Orthodox theology doesn't really go there, but that gets dogmatized at the Council of Trent. And why is this serious? Well, for me, I'm teaching theology in a a Latin Catholic school. Like I'm in the West, so I'm not just somebody showing up going to mass. I'm not someone who's just like at a college, a university, writing creative ecumenical papers as a professor, academic. No, it's just like real life. I'm teaching theology, and I want to teach theology the way that the church has always taught to my students. And so for me in this question, I felt like the East got it right. The Orthodox got it right. And I know many Eastern Catholics who would generally agree with that standpoint. But for me, it was just one more example that Orthodoxy remembers and holds on to what Roman Catholicism used to be. Though Roman Catholicism still has a lot of amazing things, but it holds on to a memory of the original thing, as G.K. Chesterton would say. So it's just kind of like one more thing. I was like, okay, there's a stability here. I will also say this: I had many friends becoming traditional Latin Catholics, and their views of purgatory were like the original, the popular Latin position over the last 600 years. And for me, that was a problematic. It's like, well, I'm much closer to Pope Benedict's view than I am towards the other perspectives. And so I had many people saying, well, you should just become a, traditional Latin Mass Catholic kind of guy. I had a friend offer me some land to live next to their TML parish. And for many people, that's how they escape the modern crisis within Roman Catholicism. They go to, 1% of the people go to Eastern Catholicism, or they go to a traditional Latin Mass parish. But for me, I couldn't do that because, number one, they still have the issue of not having infant communion, which is a novelty, an innovation. They don't offer the blood, the chalice, which is an innovation, 13th, 14th century innovation. So it's like you're not going to go there and escape innovation. And then you're also going to, I think, run into bigger problems when it comes to indulgences and how purgatory is described.
Great stuff. Right. Apologies for that little cutaway. It's been a few weeks since we last had a conversation. I had to suddenly dash off because something came up that desperately needed my attention, and then I went on holiday, and then you went on holiday, and now we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. We can't remember where we left off, so we're just sort of going to wing it. And I hope you can bear with us. So I think the last place we left it off is we were talking about your family sort of struggles, particularly your wife, who was sort of wrestling with how the fact she married a Protestant and now is teaching Catholicism and sort of moving away from Catholicism. So if we take it from there, from your point of view, like how did you start to how did the threads of Catholicism for you start to get unpicked?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way to put it, the threads of Catholicism, because I mean, there is so much that the ancient churches have in common. And so for me, I think I was kind of describing, like, for me, this was not a journey of trying to sort of like unravel something, but find the deepest meaning. I oftentimes use Lewis's quotes of further up and further in. So for me, it was just kind of like covering all these doctrines and practices that I already believe. What's the deepest, core belief that I can pull out of that? And so when I would go into each of these categories, I kept finding that I believed that Orthodoxy held on to the original understanding in the best way. And so I was teaching as a theology teacher, working at a parish, And that's the conclusion that I kept coming to. So it wasn't really my intention to unravel anything. And
Mm,
I guess one of the biggest critiques that Orthodox have of Catholicism is kind of the reverse of its critique of Protestantism, is that oftentimes Orthodox will say Protestants don't have enough. They chopped too much off, but
mm,
that Roman Catholicism has added too much.
mm,
And without getting into the weeds of what that means, um, I do think that that general big picture it holds true. And so much of the modern Catholic era is about reforming a lot of these things to bring them back in line with a little bit of those original principles. Some of those things can be done quite easily because it doesn't involve uh, as many dogmatic proclamations that are irreversible. I think in other situations, it is problematic when it comes to things that are irreversible in the area of dogma for
mm,
Roman Catholics. So that's basically kind of like where I'd been for several years. Um, and as I said, I asked my wife to consider orthodoxy, and it took us really a few years to arrive there as a family. Um,
mm,
and also, you know, Roman Catholicism is big. You can find all sorts of different camps. Uh,
mhm,
and so I tended to live much more in that Eastern Catholic camp, even
mhm,
though I didn't attend an Eastern Catholic church. I lived much more like with a kind of an Orthodox Eastern Catholic mindset with my
mm.
theology and practice.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think that yeah, you have a very good point, and I've stressed this multiple times whenever I've talked to people is that Catholicism and Orthodoxy have so much more in common than people think they do. They think it's this massive split between two churches, and both calling each other heretics and anathemas and things like that being thrown around. But actually, if you boil it down to its nitty gritty, there's just sort of a small handful of things that are different at its core. Like, obviously you have the two big ones, like, the papacy and the filioque, and then you have sort of more smaller ones um, sort of the concept of theosis within orthodoxy, and and then obviously transubstantiation and different bits and pieces like that. And when you look at it from a Protestant lens, and you look at the two churches, you just like, what on earth happened there? What happened during the schism? What caused them to go so far apart? When actually, if you look at the core beliefs, they are so similar. And so, I really do think that a lot of people need to. I think they need to admit that, because a lot of people online, especially when we're dealing with the extremes of both, like the Ortho Bros and the Vati Bros, as they get dubbed online, they take things, in my personal opinion, to an extreme, and I think that actually harms the faith on both sides, because it ends up just as a shouting match and name calling, and nothing actually ever gets solved. Um, and so I think your approach, I think, is extremely healthy, and I think it's something that should be encouraged. Is that we should be asking questions within our branch of the faith, like, why do we believe what we believe? Where do these beliefs come from? And you know, I suppose that sort of leads me on to, like, because you mentioned it took you a few years. So what was the process like, moving from Catholicism into Orthodoxy, both for yourself individually, but also like as a family, because you can't sort of leave your wife out in the cold, if that makes sense. And obviously you've got kids as well, and it must have been. Was it complicated?
Well, yeah, there's many layers to that. I think I probably need to start at the personal level, and then I could talk
Mm,
about my spouse a little bit, and then talk about like the kids, because each of those is a little bit different, honestly.
mm,
Um, for me, and I think this relates even to your last point, you know, I find myself even at like coffee hour and other places talking to like my fellow Orthodox. And like if something is said that's just like incorrect about what the Latin West believed, or the Latin Fathers, or Catholicism, I mean, I'm generally there gently saying, well, that's not quite right, you know.
mm,
So it's funny how people see you in different perspectives. Like people might see me on YouTube or they might see me on Substack writing my articles, or Instagram or Twitter. It's funny how these different mediums kind of present different versions of you, but you're like the same person. But
Mm.
I always think it would be really funny if some of my Catholic friends online saw me at coffee hour, because they'd be like, "Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Like, you just corrected some misunderstandings." And I
Mm.
think that's important. Like, you don't want to lie. You don't want to misunderstand what's going on. And that was, I will admit that looking into the Orthodox world, even though I held to like Orthodox beliefs, sometimes there can appear to be like an overly anti-Western bias, like an overly sort of Latin, even against going up against a lot of the Latin fathers. And that was a concern of mine. Um, and so I had to kind of work through that. Uh, work through that. What does that mean? Like, what does that process look like? And that's going to look different for everybody. Without getting into the details, I worked through that and had many good friends, Orthodox people who are also not like overly. You can critique the West without being like overly anti-Western. So those people were very, very helpful for me, particularly like Father Patrick Cardine in Virginia, great Orthodox priest in the Western Rite, were very helpful, and they have a lot of kind of articles helping you kind of sift through these sorts of things. So that was helpful for me, kind of at the theological level. Like, I still have a deep desire to unite the East and West. And people think that because I became Orthodox from Catholicism that I like wrote that project off. But that's very far from the truth. Like, I still actually care about it quite a bit. It's just my starting point for reunions a little bit different than maybe where
Mm.
theirs is. Um, so that was important for me, was to still maintain that unity within me. Uh, I also, I think I said this earlier, but I became I stopped being Protestant, resigned, and left Protestantism without my wife. She stayed Protestant, and I knew I couldn't do that again. I really wanted to bring her along, if possible.
Mm.
Um, so we talked, over years, but I really didn't bring it up a lot. For me, it was
Mm.
just when we would talk about theology or talk about the church, I would oftentimes be like, "Well, this is how the East does it," or "This is how." This practice, I think, could really renew the West. And so our conversations were oftentimes around those types of topics. And eventually, after, let's see, like 3.5, 4 years later, she did get to a point where she said that she was open and ready to become Orthodox. And it was a very spontaneous conversation that I didn't expect. It wasn't me bringing up, let's become Orthodox. It was just she had this sense that she was ready, that this transition could be good for our family, uh, and it was really kind of an organic thing happening over a few years, and that, of course, was a huge relief to me. It was also unexpected. I just didn't know. I mean, because I was really waiting for her. I didn't know, am I going to be in my 60s or 70s when I become Orthodox? I didn't know, but I really was hoping to be able to do it when I was still at least middle aged. Uh, and so, anyways, that's the quick sort of points about myself and and her. Of course, employment was kind of an issue since I was employed by a Catholic parish and employed by a Catholic high school. And then with the kids, in short, they were very involved in our Catholic parish and Catholic school life. And so we did kind of do the transition a little bit slower than maybe other families would have done. Um, Still kind of going to mass on Sundays for a little bit while visiting a few Orthodox parishes, and then kind of preparing the kids for when our transition was going to happen. And for
Mm.
me, I really emphasized that Orthodoxy is original Catholicism. So that's the phrase that came up in our house quite a
Mm.
bit. That you don't need to think of yourself as not Catholic anymore or not
Mm.
Catholic, but instead we're just diving deeper into Catholic Christianity.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that ultimately that way of looking at the faith is is incredibly beautiful in a way because you know I can't remember if I told you this last time, but during my journey into orthodoxy, I often describe myself as like the woman who was bleeding for 12 years, who stretched a hand out. I wanted to just touch the hem of Jesus' garment. I just wanted to stretch my hand out back through time to touch the hem of Jesus' garment and have the same faith as the apostles and the early church. And what would that look like? And for me, more and more, I realized that it, for me, and where God was leading me was into the Orthodox faith. Now, I firmly believe now, even I'm more stronger in my faith. I submit to the beliefs of the church and things like that, and that can be really jarring for a Protestant to do, especially if you're coming from certain denominations. If it's Anglican or Lutheranism, then it's a little less of an issue. But if you're coming from a non-denominational belief system, then that can be very jarring. And I think that I'm still unpicking and unlearning the sort of the quote unquote Western way of thinking. It's incredibly difficult to do, especially when you've been ingrained in Christianity as a whole for me coming up to 5 years now. And that's the difficult part for me. But when you describe it as it's a more ancient Catholicism, the sort of the OG, or the this is what the church would have looked like, back in the 300s. I think that as a whole just shows how serious orthodoxy takes things like the liturgy and the beliefs and the practices of the church, and how ancient it is and how it's preserved all of that right up until this day as best as it possibly can. And that's not to say that Catholics don't have things that they've preserved as well, but I think when you take a time machine back and you look at the sort of your typical service of the ancient church, it would basically be a mirror image of a modern day Orthodox church, and that's what I wanted. That's the originality that I wanted, and that is it's encouraging to hear other people talking about it in sort of the same way, and I think a lot of people can find a lot of substance in the Orthodox Church, which was incredibly refreshing. Like what was that's actually an interesting question. So what was the difference for you personally in terms of like levels of like teaching and like spiritual food in Catholicism to Orthodoxy? Like, you may not have thought about it before, but like for you, what was it? What was the good and the bad of both?
Well, I think one of the things that was really drawing me into Orthodoxy was how much it valued having a spiritual father and spiritual fatherhood. So just that's it. I hate saying that this is what Orthodoxy has in Catholicism, or these ancient churches don't have it or something like that. But for me, it's been preserved quite well. Doesn't mean you won't find issues here and there, but overall, like the idea of having a spiritual father and even confession sort of being much more involved in a type of spiritual fatherhood, it's very strong and alive in the Orthodox Church. And I think that is a very powerful message and value for our current sort of fatherless world. I think the way that the Orthodox Church preserves even like something as simple as coffee hour, where I was just reading stats where people are eating by themselves alone more than ever. And it's a sort of a sickness of our society that we don't have anyone to eat with. We don't have anyone to feast with, or have someone to host in our homes, or to be invited to their homes. That to me is just deeply, deeply saddening. And Orthodoxy has preserved coffee hour, like the meal after liturgy. And it's not an optional thing. You go to Orthodox church, almost all of them generally have this practice. And it's a beautiful thing. I mean, I get to know so many people in this kind of, takes us, we're hanging out for a few hours after liturgy, and it's just a wonderful bonding experience. Whether someone is just seeking Christianity for the first time, or they're a very mature Christian, we're all bonding in the same sort of meal together. So that's just two like quick examples where spiritual fatherhood, hospitality. I mean, these are things that are very strong in the early church. St. John Chrysostom talks about hospitality of strangers all the time. And it doesn't mean that I didn't have good meals in my Catholic experience, but oftentimes, in the Catholic world, this was very difficult for me as a growing up Baptist, where we had a strong community. When you have several masses with one priest, everybody's just shooting out the door right after communion, and it's very hard to build community. That doesn't mean they can't be remedied. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we're talking about big picture values here. Uh, and then just the value of like what you find in the Desert Fathers is very much still present as far as like the spiritual disciplines of fasting and repentance. All those things that you're reading in the spiritual fathers, the Desert Fathers, seem very much to be talked about in homilies like all the time. Uh, so I get those are the three examples that come to mind quickly that were drawing me in.
Yeah, I think it's sort of that thought of people shooting out of the door is brought up an issue that I think should be remedied on both sides of the aisle. I'm not just trying to insult the Catholics exclusively. No, I'm saying that there can be a problem on both sides of the aisle of poor catechesis, which is why a lot of people leave the faith and go over and become Anglican, or or even some people becoming Muslim or Sikh or Hindu and things like that. And I think we need to step up as a body, not just as with like leaders and things. I think as a whole, as a body, I think we need to step up and encourage and edify and help people navigate through these issues that they may have. Like, they may have heard a question from an atheist on the street somewhere that has really like knocked them for six, and they can't wrap their head around it, and they just can't escape the fact that maybe that atheist was right after all. And so I think catechesis is especially it can be an issue, but I think as well, I think we need to go a bit further than that and help everyone in our community, no matter what the sort of spiritual struggles we're dealing with are, in whatever capacity we can. It may be just like, oh, I think I've got a book on that. I'll here you are, I'll give it to you, or that sort of thing. I think that would go such a long way in helping people in the long run with their faith, that they won't have to feel like they do have like sort of like a safety net behind them to sort of, if they do accidentally fall back, to push them forward and to get them back upright and things like that. Like, what did you have any sort of like horror stories of bad catechesis or anything like that when you were in the Catholic Church or Orthodox,
Well,
or even the Orthodoxy?
I think I've seen incorrect catechesis in everywhere I've gone. I mean, that's just a phenomenon where we all fall short, right? I mean, so I've seen people can say wrong things, or we can say things in the wrong way, or maybe not use the best methods. I think that kind of can happen just about anywhere. A lot of that has to do with just good training and those who have the training to spend time with others and share that with others. So that runs into all sorts of areas, I would say, to be fair. I mean, I've run into some really good catechists in the Catholic Church. I mean, lots of good ones. There's a reason why they have a lot of universities and a lot of Catholic schools. And so the more that you just have, you're going to replicate both seeing excellent teachers and then really poor, really poor ones. So I think that's going to be an issue anywhere you go. When it comes to the topic of like catechesis overlapping with like community, where you're just kind of talking about apologetics, sharing your faith with Muslims or atheists, or hearing their critiques and not knowing what to do. That's where I think community is pretty important, like having maybe some kinds of like small groups. But coffee hour can take, if you organize coffee hour in a way where people are building community, those things can kind of happen organically. For example, we just opened up a library at our church. And so after people are kind of eating, they can flow over to our kind of homeschooling co-op house. And then there's like an Orthodox library, like tons of works where people can check them out. Well, there's also a big gathering table. So just this last Sunday, I was helping people check out books, but it also turned into this organic gathering of just conversations. So we were
mm,
talking about Hinduism, we were talking about um, Calvinism, we were talking about veneration of relics. I mean, it was all these fun conversations that were just kind of happening organically with people who were just visiting. I mean, a lot of them were just visiting our Orthodox parish on Sunday, and they're coming from all these different kinds of backgrounds. So
mm.
those that's kind of an organic way conversations can happen around this library. Oh, you would probably like this book, and then they can check it out for 3 weeks.
Mm,
Uh, and then it might turn into a dinner conversation, and then could lead to more formal programs uh,
mm.
of catechesis. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no,
Do I have
that's
any
great. No.
nightmare stories? I mean, I could probably think of some. It's like when someone doesn't know a basic doctrine and they say like the literal opposite of what the doctrine is, like that's kind of a horror moment for
Yeah,
catechesis, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think as well. I think it's worth, you know, especially because in Orthodoxy, this is a big emphasis on remaining humble. You know, even when you're talking to your priest, and they may have fantastic knowledge of all of these different topics and things like that. When you speak to them, you will still have that overwhelming sense of humbleness and meekness, and like, you know, just like, oh, you know, not almost sort of like not wanting to brag. And I think that is such a healthy attitude to have as a Christian, where you are, you know, the one you should be pointing to is Christ, and his gifts, and his, you know, his love and his kindness, and all these things that, you know, we look to in the church. We want to glorify Christ and glorify God, and, you know, to worship in a right and respectful manner. um I think respect is so important, whoever you're talking to. But humbleness, I think there is a lot of humbleness missing in a lot of denominations. Not everyone. A lot of people are very humble, but I think humbleness. I think the world can learn a lot from the way Orthodox do things, in the way they conduct themselves and the way they speak to people. And obviously, you have bad apples. You have bad apples in every branch of Christianity. But the overall general way of doing things, I think, is humbleness, and that's what I try to do in anything that I do. I don't try and big myself up as this massive know-it-all, you know, fancy pants person who knows every single thing under the sun. Far from it. I'll say, look, more often than not, I'm just like, I don't know, right? I'm just going to point you to this resource over here that answers your question. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, the wells are deep. I mean, there's so
yeah.
much that I don't know, and I'm a fellow learner, and it's like I
Mm,
let people know these are the categories that I'm sort of strong in, but I'm, you know, there's tons of people that know more than I do in these categories. But then I also know people who are they're just very good at talking about icons and liturgy and all these other categories. I'm like, go to them because they're gonna do a great job. So we all have our strengths that we bring to the body of Christ.
mm,
And if our pride though can get in the way of going beyond our own giftedness and our own training.
mm,
So we have to be careful about that.
yeah. The the next sort of step on your journey is, you know, sort of entering into the Orthodox faith.
Hmm.
You know, when your wife sort of said, you know, I'm ready, and then you're just like, let's go. And then, you know, you sort of take that sort of that next step. So, like, what was it like to walk through that together as a unit, as a family unit? Like, do you have any, like, tips for people
Hmm.
who might be navigating this themselves? Like, you know,
Yeah.
I like, you sort of like, I did this, so don't do that. Just do this instead, or, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, I get asked this question quite a bit by people.
Mm,
Like some people, maybe some Catholics, who are like they've already are ready to do it, but they don't know how to navigate the situation. So they might message me or get a hold of me somehow and ask for some tips. But you know, you can never replace the life of prayer with like tips. Like having a relationship with the Lord and letting the Holy Spirit guide a lot of these types of things is very, very important. Like when you're in
mm,
doubt, pray. When you're not sure what to do, pray. The prayer is pretty important. It's essential. So that's the first thing that I always tell people to do. You have to continue praying, and it's not a one size fits all for everybody. Secondly, it's okay to grieve.
Mm.
Grieving is important because it allows you to value what has been. So I did this, I grieved over the good things that I had as a Protestant, a lot of good Bible studies, a lot of good preaching, a lot of evangelism, a lot of good things. And so, I've grieved over that over the years, and that's okay. That's a good thing because it can be fulfilled in Orthodoxy. And of course, a grieving with Catholicism, my background in that though has been with me from the very beginning. I think I've been grieving over the schism for a long time, and not just the
Mm.
schism between the East and the West in 1054, but even the earlier sort of schisms that you might say happened with the Assyrian Church of the East at Ephesus, or the Oriental Coptic, Ethiopian, Armenian, all those other ancient apostolic traditions. I don't know. Not everybody's geared this way. But for me, I've kind of been grieving about those things for 15 years. Like they
Mm.
affect me in a way. Um, because I do value unity, and I also think that those traditions, the Syriac, the Greek, the Latin, they're supposed to be a part of our family tree,
Mm.
and they're supposed to be operating in us. So, there's definitely a grieving period that happens with that. That's more of like the liturgical and theological inheritance. But then there's also real friendships. So I was very involved in my Catholic parish and Catholic high school, deep friendships, brothers and sisters in Christ. And there is the grieving process is still happening in me, and it will happen until I die. And that's okay because I love these people and they love me, and we share quite a bit in common. You know, I taught Bible study with a very dear woman. I did, men's groups and trips. I was a youth minister for a while, and we did, trips to Catholic monasteries and work mission camps and all sorts of things. So I'm saying is it's okay to grieve. So that's point number two. Number three is to be very vulnerable with your spiritual father and priest about where you've come. Every I have found that whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or spiritual seekers, like everybody can be in very different places. So helping your priest know where you are. Um, I know some Catholics in Orthodoxy, they're only there because they're just angry and they're in tears. Well, that they need to get to a different place where they're not just
Mm.
running away from something. You have to be captivated with Orthodoxy,
Mm.
which I had been in that place for many years. And so not everybody's in the same place. So you need to let your priest know, because he needs to know how to handle your current situation as
Mm.
well. That's quite important. Finding a parish too that you find to be a place of hospitality and where your family can thrive uh, is important. So those are a few tips. I think because my wife didn't say yes, like in 2019 or 2020 when I asked her to consider orthodoxy, well, that allowed for a very patient journey of, a few years to take all that in. If we had done it back then, it still would have been good, but I think I learned a lot uh, during that time period.
Mm. Yeah, I think patience is so important in any marriage. When you're dealing with your spouse, you have to have patience, especially if they're working through something, and you need to be there for them no matter where they are on that journey. I mean, take for instance, recently, I don't, you probably do know this, but um apostate prophet Ridvan has recently become an Orthodox catechumen, and his wife was Orthodox, way before him, and he's been on this journey, and she's been so patient with him, and finally, he's joining. he's in the process of being received into the Orthodox Church, and that shows sort of in real time how long that can take. How you've got this journey of going from Islam to atheist to agnostic to Orthodox, and it's sort of like this. You can see it play out because he's got it all recorded on his YouTube channel of of his journey about how he doesn't believe in God, and now all of a sudden he posted a couple of days ago saying that he now believes in God. Like the Lord truly has worked a miracle with him. And I think we need to just take our time and be patient and purposely just be slow about these things. Like it's not a race. It's not this massive, like, I don't know how to describe it. Like you don't have to, it's you need to be the tortoise, not the hare. Right. And that is so important. Like if you act like the hare and you're just like, right, come on, let's go, zoom, you're not going to take everything in. You're not going to learn things. You're going to rush into things. You're going to get overwhelmed, and then you're going to panic, and then you're just going to dump it. And that's not the way to do things. Take it slow. Take it a bit at a time. There is no rush to learn everything all at once. That's why there is a catechism process. It slowly introduces you to these concepts of the faith, these beliefs that we hold to, and it's explained in a way that's easy to understand. And if you have questions, you go to your priest after the catechism class, or after liturgy, and say, look, during the catechism class this week, I did understand this. Can you potentially try and explain it in a little bit more of a simpler way? And that's what the priest is there for. For all these things, he's there to navigate the liturgy, to help bring us as a congregation closer to God, but also to be there for his congregation and answer their questions, and to be, that you have a spiritual father, and you've got this wealth of wisdom in the church fathers, and these even modern saints as well. Like you've got Saint Paisios, you've got Saint Silouan, the Athonite, you have Saint Sophrony of Essex, beautiful men who have such a profound and deep relationship with God, and we can all learn something from them. Like there is such a wealth of resources out there, and I think just take a book and just slowly read through it. That was the advice my priest gave me. Just take a book and just read just 3 pages a day. That's it. That's all you need to do. 3 pages, let it digest. 3 pages again. And then once you get to the end of the book, go back and reread it, because then you pick up more things and it starts to become ingrained in you. And that helps with the unpicking of the old ways, of shedding the Western view and learning the Orthodox view, the Eastern view, how to think with the nous of the Orthodox.
I think that's important. And particularly for those who kind of like, some people that go into liturgy and it's like they're just immediately converted. But for other people, it's like, being there for 3 hours in a liturgical experience that you've never quite had, it can also be very a steep hill. And so the way that you just kind of describe being patient and letting kind of the ocean waves just shape you, that's kind of how I think of the liturgy. It's like, when you go for your first few times, you are just getting started. You don't really know what liturgy is until you've been in it for 3 years, right? Like, and it shapes and orients you towards heaven, towards how God views reality. So I think that's important. You've got to be very patient with liturgy, and you got to make sure you're attending, services. It's pretty important.
Yeah. And the other bit of advice I would personally give people is talk to your priest about your personal situation. Like, what are your struggles that you're going through at the minute that aren't anything to do with your faith? Like, you might have health issues, you might have marital problems, you might have, you might be recovering from a serious surgery, and you might be bedbound or something like that. Just talk to your priest and let him understand where you're at, and so what you are realistically able to do. Because for some people, it may not be possible to go to liturgy every single week. Their situation just doesn't allow for that. And so by talking to your priest, you're open and you're honest with them, and they can take that into account when they're dealing with you and talking to you and say, okay, right, that's fine. That, I now know why I haven't seen that person
Yeah.
for 5 weeks,
Yeah.
because they're dealing with this, and it's fine, and that goes back to the early church. Because I did an interview with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou,
Mm.
and she said something really interesting in the fact that it's very vastly different experience of the Orthodox to the Catholics, in terms of, with Catholicism, you have, obviously, you need to attend every single week, and if you miss mass without a legitimate reason, it's considered essentially a mortal sin. And so you have to go to confession to, essentially clear that, as far as I can tell anyway, from people who keep saying that to me. And so then you have the Orthodox view, where, it sort of goes back to the early church, because, they were under persecution, and they couldn't meet in houses all the time. And so it was basically meeting whenever they can, with what they could. And that's sort of the mindset that's sort of carried on into the church now, where if you have the means and you're able to, you need to go every week. But if you physically can't go, and you have this like block of, your nan might have, your grandmother or whatever you want to call it, has had a fall, and you're the only person who can care for her, and she needs 24/7 care, and you can't come to liturgy for the next few months while she recovers. Cool, it's all good. There's no pressure to adhere to a specific doctrine or things like that, and I find that's a breath of fresh air for me personally.
Yeah, the Eastern perspective, I believe that it's grounded in a canon from Trullo, where it says, yeah, if you miss three Sundays in a row, you've entered into some bad territory, and you've entered into a habit of sin, right? That's if you are, have the means to go, and not you're not into some kind of exceptional situation. So the East and the West, they both have all these exceptions. Like, you're sick, you're caretaking, all these exemptions. But the contrast, even just how you view, the Sunday obligation. Yeah, you miss one Sunday in the West, or in the Latin code, it's like, yeah, you've descended into immediate mortal sin. And then in the East, it was more habit based. You clearly have a sickness if you don't want to be here with us, right? So there tends to be kind of even a little bit of a different approach when it comes to how sin is viewed. Uh, uh, which it makes sense, because the East talks a lot about the church being a hospital, and the priest being a physician, and healing and confession being much more in that kind of mode than just say, even in confession, there's a little bit of a difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, where it's like, in Catholicism, it's very important that you say, when you did the sin, how many times you did it, which can still be fine to do in Orthodoxy, if you really need to be super transparent for specific reasons. But in the West, it's very much about that, the legality, like the times, the places, and then your absolution, and then you do your quick, penance. Though if you have a good spiritual confessor, he'll give you a good penance. One Catholic priest said, "Take flowers to your wife." I'm like, that's a good penance, because go take her on a date. I'm like, you are a good priest, versus just say a Hail Mary and be done. In Orthodoxy, the way that confession is done, of course you're mentioning your sins, of course you're mentioning your habits, but the concern about those little details are a little bit different. So it's just a little bit of a different approach. It doesn't mean that I'm saying, oh, they're doing it all horribly wrong. I'm just saying the emphasis is a little bit different, that you see, even how you talk about the Sunday obligation.
Yeah.
So this comes up when I talk to Protestants quite a bit. Like, well, what's the difference in confession between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, or how you view Sunday obligation? So a lot of these kind of conversations come up when I'm talking to Protestants. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in a way, it just sort of highlights the viewpoint of the East and the West. In a nutshell, you've got, you have boiling it down to its sort of bare basics. You have, in Catholicism, you have the priest that's behind sort of like a screen or a partition, and the priest doesn't see the person who's confessing, and even though it's probably easy to pick out from their voice, and if they're a regular, member of the parish, or what have you, and the whole point is the sort of the secrecy and the sort of like the sort of the shroud. It's shrouded in sort of like it's all enclosed off, if that makes sense. Like it's sort of put in this little box, and no one ever sort of is allowed to sort of peek inside from whether it's the priest or that sort of thing. But in Orthodoxy, obviously the same concept as its core is still there, but then it's done in the open. Like it's often it's done in front of the iconostasis and the or even in an office, and it's open. It's not like, and you're next to the priest, and
Right.
he's there to help you and to guide you, not to judge, but and to encourage. But he's there very much in a very sort of formal way. In it's just his sheer presence, just to say, I'm here for you, and this is what we're going to do, and this is the way to do it, and I pray a prayer of absolution over you afterwards, and it's done. But it sort of highlights the differences between the East and the West in terms of the way of doing things, which again goes back to the core sort of like the nous, the mindset of the East versus the West. The West very analytical and very sort of matter of fact and analogies and getting to the nitty gritty and trying to explain everything. Whereas the East is very much embraces the mysterious and the mystical and the spiritual nature of things, which for me anyway, is both simultaneously a little scary coming from a Western point of view, but also is very freeing. Like, you submit to the church, you submit to the beliefs, you submit to what your priest says, and if there's something that the Orthodox Church just hasn't explained, right? Like, for instance, the Eucharist, how it becomes the body and the blood of Christ. You say, that's mystery. And we're fine with it. Like, it does, not everything has to be explained down to the finest detail, which sort of, again, highlights how different these churches are in terms of like the way they do things, but not at their core. Like the fundamentals of the belief and the faith are the same.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with making a distinction. Sometimes the distinctions have to be made so that we don't, when
that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Like, for example, when it comes to like icons and worship, and that distinction between sort of latria and dulia, the honor versus the like worship that's only given to God, right? We want that distinction to be made. That's important, right? We don't want to be committing idolatry. So distinctions that can be helpful. The issue is when you get into what I call hyper scholasticism. I try to be very careful with my terminology because I mean, there's even a type of scholasticism happening in the East. I mean, in the Middle Ages, but it's not where the West goes. C.S. Lewis kind of critiques where the West goes with its hyper scholasticism. He's like, the moment that Aristotle, who is sort of like the philosopher of distinctions, he's introduced through his best disciple Aquinas. He's like, after Aquinas, what do you do? What do you see happen with Thomism? It's just like hair splitting, just like century after century after century, and then you get all this giant manualist tradition. And so with that introduction, that's when you get into like hyper scholasticism. And so that's where I think we have to be careful. And I think the East is a good response to what happened in the late West. And really what's happening in modern Catholicism is responding to that. Like when you look at the work of like Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, a lot of the scholars and teachers after Vatican II, a lot of them are trying to like return to the older patristic model of the fathers. Like they're responding to that, like only Thomism and all the manualist tradition. They're responding to that. The problem is after Vatican II, not everybody's doing the same project. Multiple projects arise after Vatican II, and that's created the modern chaos in the Roman Catholic Church, is that you have a lot of different camps and schools doing different things that are on the same page. And so even in the Vatican, different cardinals have different almost schemes going through their head about what they want the church to look like. And it's like, well, we shouldn't have an epicenter that with all these cardinals with different schemes going through their heads about what they want the church to look like. We know what the church is and what it is
Mm,
to look like. It doesn't mean we won't have crises and we don't have things to work
mm,
through and to overcome. But that's a bit of the sort of the trauma that's happened after Vatican II. And of course, those documents in Vatican II are not the same as exactly what happened after Vatican II. Like those documents don't
mm,
say overhaul all the liturgy, but that's
mm.
what happens, and so it creates this type of trauma. And
Yep.
so that's what's going on. And really, Orthodoxy doesn't have anything quite comparable to that. We've got our own issues, but
Mm,
it's not comparable to that.
yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of something that I think, again, it sort of comes back to how serious we take tradition as a faith, like, and how we handle things within the church is very we're very sort of quick to sort things out if problems arise, because we don't want heresy popping up. We don't want, further schisms happening and things like that. So things have to be dealt with. Things have to happen, and that sort of, you have, unfortunately, in Catholicism, you have scandals that happen. Not to say that scandals don't happen in the Orthodox Church, but nowhere near on the level as to what has happened, even in recent years with the Catholic Church, with heaven forbid, all this stuff to do with paedophilia and stuff. It's horrible to read, and those the poor victims, and you read about how long the Catholic Church took to sort of acknowledge these issues and stuff, and you just, that level of controversy doesn't reach over to Orthodoxy, because I think Orthodoxy keeps the tradition so tightly, and keeps the way of doing things so tightly, that there really isn't room for these things to happen, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah. Let me comment on that.
Mm,
Part of it's because I do have a background in social work a little bit, so
mm,
abuse happens everywhere. Like that's just
yes.
hands down. You can be schools and teachers, coaches and sports, priests and parishes. You can go parents, family. Most of it almost happens in families, like
Mm,
90% of it. It's sad. It's devastating. This is just the most horrible things you can talk about is this sort of thing.
yeah.
So it happens everywhere. We have canons and we have documents from the early church talking about, disciplinary measures towards priests who do sorts of things like these sorts of things,
Mm,
right? So it's not that the church is unaffected by this. It's
mm,
about though how is it to be dealt with?
mm,
And I think that orthodoxy, the advantage that it has, it doesn't mean that sometimes secrets aren't kept or abuse doesn't happen and people don't report it.
yeah.
That, I mean, again, that happens everywhere.
Mm,
But it's the way that the authority structures work. One of the problems that began happening in the Catholic West, in Roman Catholicism, is that like all the bishops and metropolitans, archbishops, they all felt like they just didn't have the authority to act in these situations, and they needed to report them all to the Vatican. And so how is one agency in Rome supposed to deal with like this crisis that's happening everywhere, to the point where
mm,
like even like whole networks of bishops are like, for example, like Chile, they were like all the bishops submitted their resignation to Pope Francis because the network there was just so bad, just very
mm,
bad. And the question is like, how did it get to that point?
yep.
Well, in many ways, it it the it's an abandonment of like the metropolitan and bishop and the whole sort of like um system of primacy having an effect in those
Mm,
regions. So if you report it to a higher up, it should be dealt with by the synod or by the metropolitan. Again, I'm not going to say that cover-ups don't happen everywhere, but if you're all sending it to one center, there's going to be a problem. And that's actually, I mean, to Pope Francis's benefit, he actually returned to ancient canon law that the Orthodox follow, and he
mm,
and he basically uh, re rewrote or brought back old canon law, which said that a bishop is supposed to report to like his archbishop or metropolitan, and can report about another bishop who is either covering up or abuse, and that
Mm,
metropolitan's supposed to deal with it.
mm,
Like it's supposed to get dealt with before it heads to the Vatican. That's a good thing. How well is it working at the moment? Well, I think everything's so new that they're not really sure because they don't even remember what an archbishop or a metropolitan really is, like the significance of that, having some type of authority. So the moment that they can rediscover that sort of ancient mindset,
mm,
it's only going to do good things and shutting those things down so they don't
yeah.
build up like over time.
Mm,
That would be my quick sort of take on
yeah.
that.
Yeah. And that's basically in a nutshell what I was trying to do, what I was trying to
Yeah.
say.
You said it. I was
Um,
just trying to kind of broaden the
yeah,
picture a little bit. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and again, like we're not trying to like tarnish Catholicism with this horrible brush. We're not, stuff like that does happen in the Orthodox Church. It's just that the way the Orthodox Church is set up, it's sort of like it's built into the system to be able to deal with these things when they arise, as opposed to sort of leading to a sort of existential crisis, if that makes sense, which is sort of what happened.
I mean, it's kind of like a
Um,
balance of power, like how you have
yeah,
accountability, even like in the United
mm,
States. I mean, I know yours is set up a little bit differently, but you have like the White House, the presidency, you have Congress with the Senate, and you have the Supreme Court, and they're meant to like balance each other out.
mm,
Well, I think when you study the first millennium church, that actually like you have like a council that is ultimate. You definitely have like bishops with authority, but those bishops are accountable to synods and
mm,
metropolitans, and so there is like this system of accountability along with canons being enforced. And so, anyways, all this to be said, I think there's a lot of wisdom when you look to what people might critique as the messiness of orthodoxy. That
mm,
messiness can also be a similar type of messiness that you might even see um, in like a type of republic, like the United States versus like a dictatorship,
mm,
right? A dictatorship's very efficient, right?
mm,
And people critique democracy. Well, you got this one president and then this president, and then you got this and that. Well, sometimes messiness can produce greater accountability structures, so we're less
mm.
likely to change our tradition. Um,
Yeah,
that's just at least one response. So
yeah,
messiness doesn't always
exactly.
mean it's a bad thing.
Mm,
Which there is messiness in orthodoxy. Like you have to kind of be okay with a little bit of messiness when it comes to
mm,
like how our hierarchs relate to each other. It's not always as pretty as we would like, but
yeah.
that also looks like the church you see in the first millennium. So
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, take for example, you have the falling out between the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, where they're sort of at, locking horns, if that makes sense. But then it doesn't affect the laity, and it's sort of like this extra layer of complicatedness, if that makes sense, where the laity can, go to each church, vice versa, and receive the Eucharist and the sacraments and things like that. But when you get to the sort of like the higher up the chain, it's very much sort of like a partition wall. It's sort of like this little like underground tunnel going between the two,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you can you sort of you get a sense of like it does get messy. People do fall out with each other, and people do get irritated and to have this sort of like gripe with one another, and you will find that wherever you go, there is no perfect church to a T. Like there is no perfection, because ultimately we will always get our grubby little human mitts on it and tarnish it in some way, and that's you have to sort of be okay with that sort of thing when you're coming into the ancient
yeah.
faith.
I think Father Josiah Trenum even has a little video that says, it's the true church, not the perfect church, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that's very important for people, especially if they're running away from problems. If they're running away from problems in Protestantism or
Mm,
somewhere else like Catholicism, you don't want to set yourself up
no.
because you could become Orthodox just because you're running away from something, and then just leave Orthodoxy and then become, well, I've already been through everything else. I'm just going to become an agnostic or something, because you're always running away from something. And I
Mm,
mean, if you're in that mode, I mean, would you even run away from the first century church? I mean, spend some time reading the Bible, like read First Corinthians and the churches that Paul was starting. are quite messy, have a lot of problems, a lot of sin from all in every direction. So I think part of it is we need to realize we're the ones, we need to start with ourselves. Christ wants to do work in us and me. And then if we're all doing that together, that's when holiness is produced. But if we're always just pointing our fingers as everybody else being the problem and we're just running away from them, it's going to produce a lot of spiritual problems in your own life.
Yep, exactly. Couldn't put it better myself, even though I tried. I think one thing I'd like to sort of get your take on again is sort of circling back to C.S. Lewis, because what you mentioned that he sort of popped up a numerous amount of times during your journey. So, what was his role in your journey from Catholicism to Orthodoxy? I mean, did he play a part, or was it sort of just?
Well, I think C.S. Lewis has just always been there for me. Like, has he been like a critical player in all of these junctures of my life? I don't know if I would call him critical, but he's always there. He's always like a voice in some ways, because in growing up as an evangelical, I didn't have a lot of like deep intellectual stuff coming from like the pulpit or from my classes. And so C.S. Lewis for a lot of evangelicals is kind of like a person that helps them build up a deeply profound Christian worldview. And even in his book, Mere Christianity, which sounds kind of simple, right? Mere. I mean, he's getting into like St. Athanasius and theosis, and he's getting into other ways to look at Christ's atonement than maybe just penal substitution. And he's getting into like other perspectives. And so he can help people sort of be a nice bridge into church history and the fathers, and looking at the world a little bit differently, even through his fiction, whether that be Narnia or the Screw Tape Letters, which if you just read the Screw Tape Letters, some of that reads kind of like the Desert Fathers. It's not the same thing, but it has a similar type of feel. So a lot of this stuff can be important. And so it played a role in me discovering like the ancient church. I remember reading I remember reading his essay long ago, and I hated it at the time. This was probably, let's see here, 18, 20 years ago when I read Lewis's essay against women in the priesthood. I just didn't like the essay, partly because I didn't buy into a priesthood yet, and I didn't understand the connection between how God has designed nature and in connection to like the priesthood. So I hated the essay. But at the same time, I also took Lewis seriously enough to understand he had like a different view of clergy and pastors. Like he used the word priest. He talked about the Eucharist in very high ways. He looked at the afterlife in ways that I didn't understand. He prayed for the dead. All these things we go down the list. So he was definitely a challenge to me, and he introduced me to the ancient churches. My best friend was the president of the C.S. Lewis Society, and then many people around him became Catholic or Orthodox. And so leaving sort of the collapsing Anglican Church in England. So now into my journey of orthodoxy, I think Lewis was still there. I think I'm still trying to grasp how so. I think he has I definitely think that Lewis has a sense of what the church is to be like, even though he never became Orthodox himself. I think he had a sense. I think even like how he tried to struggle with like the afterlife and prayer for the dead and what's going on there. I actually think that he has a much more Orthodox perspective. I think I said this earlier in the interview. But I think he has a much more Orthodox instinct about the nature of all those things than where the Latin West kind of went. And so he's critiquing that. Of course, in the modern era, there's been a big like renovation of purgatory in the modern Catholic era. But and I think actually C.S. Lewis influenced that a bit. I think C.S. Lewis even kind of influenced some of these thinkers during his time in the 60s. But all this to be said, I do think that Lewis has been there. I've always enjoyed overlap, like seeing the intersection between like his works and like the fathers. And so that's just kind of like where I've been. Of course, you got Dr. Edith Humphrey's book up there, further up and further in. So she kind of has a nice book, The Orthodox Intersections, with Lewis's thought. So I did he push me into orthodoxy? No, I wouldn't say that. But I think he's just always there and will always be there for me in some sense.
No, that's lovely. And I mean, C.S. Lewis is sort of like one of those people that come across like come along like once in a generation, that just profoundly change the way you think about Christianity and change how you understand like scripture and the role of the church and the church fathers, and all these things. I think those types of people where they can sort of weave all of that into one and yet stay relevant to all of the different denominations at one time, I think is I'd say masterful. It's also, I think Lewis was definitely a gift from God on the world, 100%. I think that we can, no matter where we are in our journey and who what denomination we belong to, we can all learn something from Lewis. Whatever that is, whether it's some small thing that we can glean from it that can deepen our relationship with God, is always a good thing. And I think, to be honest, I think that sort of takes us up to where you are now, and that sort of wraps up your journey. And I think what sort of do you have any sort of like encouragement to or words of wisdom you can give to people who might be struggling with this currently, like this journey?
Well, I mean, life's a journey, like a pilgrimage. So it's good to think of it like that. I think early in the conversation, you were really emphasizing patience and prayer and repentance, humility. All those things are very, very important. And I think Lewis also took those things seriously too. So I think that's very important. Like, you're on a pilgrimage, you're on a journey, you're going to hit into mysteries. But for me, I mean, I do believe that Christ has like led me to holy orthodoxy, and that it is a fulfillment of like the deepest aspects of what Christ meant for the church and Christianity for the world. I truly believe if we had a more orthodox future around the world, that it would do many good things. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't still be issues or all those things. That those things won't happen until Christ comes back. But I do think that orthodoxy has held on to like these not just like orthodox beliefs, but like the ancient way of like the path of what it means to be a Christian. Like, they take the way of worship and the way of theosis and salvation very, very seriously. It's always emphasized. And so I think that that's going to do really great things for you. So like, come and see, like visit Orthodox parishes, join us, be patient, ask all your questions. I mean, it's so much fun to see how many visitors are coming to our parish with people from all different kinds of backgrounds. Whether people think it's just like Protestants just showing up. No, like, there are people coming from all sorts of backgrounds. And it's wild and it's fun. And people are finding the Orthodox Church in all sorts of ways. So always pray, be patient. I always tell people, don't get overly anxious, because we do a lot of stupid things based upon fear. A lot of stupid things. And so when people get very like overly anxious, and I understand we're dealing with our salvation, but if you're, again, if you're praying, if you're being patient, if you're submitting yourself to the Lord, like, don't get overly anxious. Just keep chugging along. But people are very anxious these days, because they're very lonely. They're afraid to lose people that they do have if they make the decision to become Orthodox. But in all things, trust the Lord. If he can provide for the birds and the flowers, he can provide for you each and every day.
Yep. Amen to that. Well, thank you so much for joining me, even though this entire episode took over 2 weeks to produce. But life happens. So what where can people find you, Like,
Yeah,
what do you
Barrel.
do online?
Find me at Barrel Age Faith on YouTube. I have a Substack, barrelagefaith.com. You can find me other places too, but really YouTube and Substack are the main places I operate. We're also coming up with like paid, exclusive things for paid subscribers. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is Seraphim Hamilton, a great Orthodox scripture teacher, Bible teacher, with a lot of also background, master's and PhD or THD level, sorry, not PhD, but THD level background in theology. He's going to be teaching a course on Barrel Age Faith through the book of Ephesians. So we hope to do more of that, kind of helping people read the Bible, particularly book by book, chapter by chapter, with an Orthodox lens, like reading it with the fathers. So we're going to be going through the book of Ephesians after Pascha. So it's a great opportunity for only $5 a month to like go through this awesome book with Seraphim Hamilton. I'm also currently going through, I've started like a series on the afterlife, the journey of the soul, and it's going to like hopefully just keep going until I die. So it'll be kind of like a revolving door. So like initially I'm just kind of doing some response videos for my paid subscribers, and then it's turning into like more of like a formal academic course. But it's I'm just kind of in a warm up stage to help people see a little bit of the differences in thought between how Orthodox think of the afterlife compared to Protestant and Catholic conceptions. And then I'm also going to be going through a third module, which would be like on the Great Divorce with C.S. Lewis, and comparing kind of the thought at like St. Mark of Ephesus at Florence and Orthodox thought of the afterlife with the thought of C.S. Lewis and the Great Divorce. So that's and I'll keep going with other topics in what we call eschatology. So life after death, the end of the world, Antichrist, Book of Revelation, all sorts of things like that. It'll just keep going. So it'll be a lot of fun. I think a lot of people are interested in that topic. And the Orthodox Church has a lot of just so many wonderful resources in this this area. So that's one of a big focus that I've always had for the last kind of decade, is that area.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Kyle. It's been an absolute blessing. Thank you to you, the viewer watching. If you haven't already, please do subscribe over on Barrel Age Faith. The links are in the description below. But also as well, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. And like the video, share it out to someone who might enjoy this conversation. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video. Adios.
Bye-bye.